Hi, thanks for coming to the video. So, I'm going to divide this into three parts, so just bear with me. If you manage to watch it the whole way through, there are three parts to this video, okay? So, that's how I'm approaching this one. The first part is sort of a response to, and it's a follow-up to the video I made last night on Patrick Christys of GB News and the reaction around what he said regarding the lunar landing. I'm not going to repeat everything I said in that video, but I stand by it. The only thing I would say is he perhaps did oversimplify the issue of foreign aid, and perhaps I could have mentioned that in the video because the foreign aid doesn't go directly to the Indian government; it goes to NGOs. But other than that, the wider issue of foreign aid was something he was raising. It's something that has been raised many times in the UK, and it's completely legitimate for a journalist to do that. Now, whether you agree with him or not is beside the point. Just as contentious issues are debated on Indian news networks, contentious issues are debated on British news networks. So I don't expect Indians not to respond because it's about India, but I maintain that the response has been hugely overblown. Why? Because this is most of the British coverage. Okay, positive. This is how most of the British coverage has reported the story of the lunar landing, the Chandrayaan 3 mission. Um, the British government, the British Space Agency, the King, the BBC, Sky News, they've all either congratulated it or spoken of the scientific achievement, and reported it as it is a big scientific achievement. Because whilst other countries have had lunar probes on the moon, India is the first country to get to the South Pole, which is difficult because of the terrain. I understand it's difficult to land a probe there. So it is a major scientific achievement, and apparently it used even less technology than was made in the film Interstellar, which is incredible. So, anyone with appreciation for technology or science would be impressed. It's definitely a big thing. But there's no denying it's also a nationalistic thing for India because it's a moment of national glory. Um, anyway, the response to Christie's, instead of focusing on all the positive coverage that's been happening in the UK, the likes of Palki Sharma of We All News and others have said, "Oh look, it's the jealous Brits," or they still have the colonialist mindset, or um, other sort of acrimonious angles that they're taking with this, ignoring the fact most of the coverage has been positive. So I have a problem with that. I have a problem with distorting the position of my country and distorting, the responses from Britain. This idea that the British are all bitter about India's success, it's a lie. It's just a lie. So I think for the likes of Palki Sharma to be deliberately promoting that lie is very irresponsible. But it's not the first time she's done it. I do think she is anti-British. I think she's shown it many times. I'm focusing on her because she's particularly outspoken, but no doubt there are others. Um, every single time she talks about the UK, it's negative every time. So it's predictable. Uh, But she's an Indian national, so she can do no wrong. She's just telling it like it is. Um, so what I would say is whether you agree with Mr. Christie's or not, the issue here is about certainly freedom of speech, but also the right for a journalist to raise the question. This idea that he should apologise or he should humble himself is nonsense. And I hope he doesn't give in to mob pressure. And I hope GB News doesn't give in to mob pressure. Whether or not you agree with his argument, what he's talking about is the policy. He's not attacking the Indian people. In fact, he pointed out that one of the problems in India is millions of people still live in poverty. But his critique was of the policy of how foreign aid is allocated. It wasn't attacking the Indian people, and that's again a distortion. So he's now being vilified as a racist. But talking about foreign aid in this way is a legitimate question. whether you agree with him or not. And like I say, he was oversimplifying things. That was his mistake. But I think it's a legitimate question. Um, that's that. So it's just, once again, we see um, one thing being taken out of context, or rather taken out of proportion, and being used as a battering ram for the whole country. This has happened before, no doubt, unfortunately, will happen again. Another example was when British football hooligans were, making an ass out of themselves. Sorry for the language, YouTube. I think it was the Euro finals. Again, Palki Sharma was saying, "Oh, this is how they behave in other countries," but she wasn't talking about hooligans. She was talking about the British in general. So she used that one negative thing to attack the British as a whole. I think she's an anti-British bigot. I'd even say an anti-British racist, because she clearly has a problem with the British people. It's very obvious, and she shows it time and time again. Um, and the difference is Christys wasn't actually attacking the Indian people; he was attacking the policy. Now, the second thing I want to talk about is Anglo-Indian relations, because this kind of taps into what Christys was driving at, and it taps into. But to be honest, I'm talking a lot about him, but this is much bigger than one journalist. Um, I think Anglo-Indian relations are important fundamentally. Of course, they're important, and I think that we cannot ignore the ties of history. The fact is, the British Empire was the largest empire in history, and India was the centre of that empire. Well, London was the centre administratively, and it was the capital, but India was the jewel in the empire, right? That's how Britain viewed it, um, and so the prism of imperialism is always going to sort of be there, much like the way France relates to its former colonies, or Spain to its former colonies. And I'm not saying colonies here in a patronising sense. I'm just saying that's what it was in the past. Um, so France and Spain will have similar. The Netherlands and Belgium, they're going to have similar debates with the respective countries that they colonised. But I think with Britain particularly, because we were such a big empire, it's it's forever going to be an issue of perhaps controversy or contention. But my question for Indian nationalists is, should this always be the prism in which British Indian relations are conducted? Should it always be from the angle of the past? I mean, if we look at the situation today, there is a lot of people in the UK, obviously the Indian diaspora. There are people who are first, second, third generation Indians. It needs no introduction. Our Prime Minister is of Indian descent, famously, Rishi Sunak. Other prominent British Indians in politics, Priti Patel and others. Um, it's just extensive. It's something that is deeply embedded in our society. The Indian diaspora. Some curries were invented in the UK in Birmingham. Um, that those ties, therefore, are very old, and and I've just scratched the surface. There's lots of other things, of course, but that's there. If we look at the legacy of empire, I am the first to admit, of course, there was exploitation. Of course, there was cruelty. There was massacres. There was Amritsar. There was numerous famines in British India. It killed millions of people. So I don't say Indians shouldn't have any thoughts on that. They shouldn't have any feelings. I've never said that. But I do take issue with constantly using the past as a battering ram, because it does get further in the past now. We're, at this point, it's 76 years since India became independent. It will soon be 80 years, and it's going further back in time. So to always use the wrongs of empire as a sort of battering ram, I think is wrong. Um, because if you're constantly shaming people, then they're going to be defensive. This idea that the British should just bow our heads in shame, it's very misplaced. Now, in terms of ongoing disputes, for example, about the British Museum and artifacts in it, I think the onus is on us to find some sort of compromise, or where it is plausible, frankly, hand things back. I am now of that view that for the sake of good relations, for the sake of doing what's right, we probably should find some compromise to that. But I also think regarding the British Museum, there is an argument that if every national museum in the world just hosted its own national products, then there wouldn't be a museum where you could collectively see the world's treasures. You'd have to travel. The travel isn't easy for a lot of people. It's not. The argument with that is that you have one venue. I mean, it could be the same in India. You could have a museum in India which has artifacts from around the world, and that would be the same argument. Well, they're in one place. Um, on the issue of empire, though, there's a point worth bearing in mind. Every power in history has sought to increase its size or influence. If history had been different and India had been the first industrialized nation, and there had been an Indian Western company, and Indian explorers had sailed around the world and maybe reached Europe, I think it's very plausible that there would have been an Indian empire. It never happened, obviously, it's just speculation, but every power in history has sought to expand or colonize. It's just saying, I don't want to say it's human nature, that's perhaps a little bit crude, but it's a fact of world history. Every power has sought its moment in the sun, its point of glory. The British sometimes get focused on because we were such a big empire, but if the situation was reversed, India would have done the same thing. I really believe that. But the other thing is, before the British, India wasn't actually a unified state. There were princely states. This is one of the distortions regarding the Raj. This idea that there was a unified Indian state and the British came in and took it over. It was more complex than that. Um, but we have mutual interests. I mean, many Indian doctors work in the UK. There's other Indian professionals. Um, Indians are seen as educated, skilled people. That's so. Actually, the British perception of Indians is a positive one. Um, but the question is going forward. I believe recently there's been some negotiations regarding between London and New Delhi regarding waivers for students. Things like that, we can definitely accommodate that. I think, for example, making the process and easier for Indian students, allowing situations like that to sort of have some flexibility. I think that would be a goodwill gesture for good relations. So, from the British point of view, I'm all for accommodating Indian requests in that regard. But I also think that for many Indian nationalists, the whole approach to working with the UK is based on, well, let's bring up the empire every time there's disagreements. Let's use the empire and imperial wrongs as a battering ram, to collectively shame the British. But the thing is, when you try to shame, no one's ever going to thank you for that. No one's ever going to accept that. I mean, who would? If I bring up, for example, things that have happened in post-independence India, Operation Blue Star, or sometimes the brutal policies of the Indian Army in northeast India, Indian nationalists are just going to be defensive. They're either going to deny it, justify it, or pretend it isn't even happening. If I bring up the issue of caste discrimination, it's illegal in India, but it still happens. Then the response would be very defensive and nationalistic. Oh, this doesn't happen, or it's a distortion, or something like that. So why should Britons just be okay with our country being shamed, but when things that go wrong in India are brought up, then it's denialism? Because the thing is, very few Britons boast about the empire. Even patriotic Britons don't go out of their way to say, "Oh, we had the biggest empire. Let's be proud of it," and sort of gloat about that. So my question is, why is it that Indian nationalism is to be applauded and celebrated, but British nationalism is to be shamed? I'm not a nationalist. I see myself as patriotic, and I don't like nationalism, but I'm just asking this question: why the double standards? That's perhaps more broadly to look at. There are certainly areas I think Britain and India can work together. I think that, like I've mentioned, the mutual sort of interest in terms of the Indian diaspora, and also Britain's in India. It's probably not on the same level. I'm not sure what the numbers are, but there would be tourists, probably some businesses. Um, Maybe I'm not sure if there's British students in India. I'm not sure if there's any sort of programs to that effect. But the British Council operates in India. Britons visit India for holiday, so there's going to be those sort of connections as well. Um, Most Britons hold India actually in a positive light. I do, broadly speaking, apart from the nationalism that I'm talking about. I think India is a great country. I think it's a very rich culture. I haven't yet had the opportunity to visit. I hope one day I will. I mean, India's got some of the world's most sacred sites. Taj Mahal and many others. It is one of the world's great civilizations, the Indus Valley civilization. But I also think, as you always get with nationalism, there's also hyperbole and exaggeration. I've been seeing a Hindutva platform on Facebook, and it keeps coming up with these sort of supremacy claims. For example, it shows the glorious Indus Valley civilization in 7000 BC. Actually, the peak was about 3,500 years ago. But then it shows another image of Stone Age people. I mentioned this in the last video. Rest of the world, like look how superior we Indians are. It's a supremacist mindset, um, and it's misplaced because that isn't actually. It's a little bit like when the Chinese talk about 5,000 years of history. Well, it depends how you gauge that. Certainly, China has a very, very um, long civilization, but when does civilization begin? Is it the development of cities? Is it, how is that gauged? There's debate on that. But the 5,000 years of history that the Chinese use, it's the oldest Chinese dynasty, historic dynasty, the Shang dynasty, goes back about 3,600 years. So, likewise, there are exaggerations about the Indus Valley civilization, great as it was. There are exaggerations. Um, I think that if we're talking about mutual respect, um, I think that Britain has to be honest about its imperial past. I think we have to be honest that we did exploit India. But with empire, I would make this point. If the British just came in and just killed everyone and, stole everything like that, how could it be? How could it be that 100,000 civil servants backed up by um, so many thousand British soldiers, could control a country then of or a land of 400 million people? So it's overly simplistic to say the evil British just came in and killed everyone, because if we'd done that, the sheer numbers would have been just overwhelmed the British. It didn't happen. It's the reality is that empire had good and bad. I mean, this is a controversial thing to say because it sounds like apologizing for empire. I don't think it is. I think it's just pointing out the reality. Institutions, courts, universities, railways, all those things were set up by the British. They happened in the Raj. We also abolished some practices, for example, the practice of sati, I think it was called. I'm maybe pronouncing that wrong, but the idea that a Hindu wife should self sacrifice when her husband died, the British abolished that. Now, is anyone going to say that was a bad thing? The negative thing, of course, was it wasn't our land. We went in, we exploited, we put people down. It was a racist mentality. I don't deny that. I think going forward with Anglo-Indian relations, if it's to be about mutual respect, the Indian side cannot always use imperialism or the past as a battering ram every time, something is trying to be negotiated or there's differences. Let's talk about the situation today in 2023. The final point I'm going to make, and I'm going to have to round this up soon for time reasons, is the rise of India, right? I'm talking about India as a nation state in 2023. For most of the 21st century, the focus has been on China for obvious reasons. And India's kind of always been secondary to that. And occasionally there's been conflict between India and China. It's never quite got to the point of outright war, thank goodness, comparable to the 1965 conflict, because today it would be far more dangerous. Both countries are economically bigger. I think the implications would be much more serious than they were in that conflict. But there are occasionally clashes. 2021, I believe, or 2020, that violent clashes in the Himalayas, and there were deaths, mostly on the Indian side. If there was to be a war between India and China, it would be really, really, it would be much bigger than Russia and Ukraine probably. Um, but on the issue of Russia and Ukraine, why is it the world's biggest democracy sat on the fence? I think it was a missed opportunity by New Delhi to take a more forceful position and condemn Russia's invasion. I mean, what had Ukraine done to India? Ukraine never colonized India. I think that was a missed opportunity by India to take a leadership stance. I think sitting on the fence when it comes to Putin's aggression is wrong. Now, when Lavrov spoke to an Indian university, I think it was in Bengaluru, he was laughed at when he claimed that the West started the war. So at least, young Indians on that occasion, they could see the fallacy of the Russian argument. But I do think India could be more assertive in its Ukraine policy. And it's pretty obvious it's about trade, as it was during the Cold War, because I think I don't see India as either an ally or an adversary. I think it's a partner. I think that's probably the appropriate word to use. Um, During the Cold War, there were times that India was certainly non-aligned, and at times, if anything, especially under Indira Gandhi, if anything, pro-Soviet. And Pakistan was the country that was on the side of the West. So I've heard Indians saying, "Oh, why should we support Ukraine when the West has never supported India?" But if we're being honest about this, has India always supported the West? Not necessarily. During World War II, as part of the empire, of course, India played a very important role, but that was pre-independence. Um, Gandhi, to his credit, and other Indian nationalists of the time did see the bigger picture, but again, that's going to be a matter of historic debates. Um, Going forward, I mean, it's going to be a while before India gets to China's level, but something very significant has happened this year. India has just surpassed China by many measures to be the world's most populous country. Worldometer certainly lists it that way. Could it be that in the future, on one hand, we have these great scientific developments, and if I was an Indian, I would be proud of that. But how is that going to be coupled with, for example, ongoing religious tensions on the ground? I think under Modi, although India remains a democracy, it's a multi-party state. There's a plurality of opinions. Issues are debated rigorously. But I do think under Modi, intolerant nationalism has been on the rise, irrefutably. Irrefutably. Life for India's minorities has got harder on Modi's watch. I don't think anyone could deny that. This is not to say that the situation in India is suddenly like China. It's not. It's not a single party state. But I do think that there is legitimate concerns about what's happening. So on one hand, there's this sort of nationalistic pride and this, scientific development. But the fact is, a lot of Indians do remain in chronic poverty. There are human rights issues on the ground. There are religious tensions on the ground. Now, to be fair, Indian networks will themselves debate these things. I've seen that. I've seen that. The case of the Hindu teacher who got students to beat a Muslim boy in Uttar Pradesh, that's been rigorously debated. And to be fair, most reasonable Indians are condemning that. They see that it's awful and that teacher should lose her job. But the point I'm making here is this sort of thing is increasing, um, has been increasing over the last 9 years on Modi's watch. So, if as a journalist, I've trained as a journalist, if I was to report, for example, the Manipur violence, what I would do is try to get both sides. I try to get as many perspectives as I can. I try to get a police interview. I try to get the victims of the violence. I try to get every perspective. But because I'm British, if I was to do a report on that, it would still be, oh, British bias about India. So there is, I would say, hypersensitive reactionary attitude, which is unfortunate, because it's just overblown, just overblown. Of course, India is a huge country, and I'm talking about this being overblown, but maybe most Indians aren't even aware of the Patrick Christys story. But there will be Indian networks that are pushing this, and they're pushing this distortion. That is why it's so important that, the truth be told, this is the British country. So, I'm not a nationalist, but I love my country, and I will speak out when I think it's being unfairly portrayed. And on this occasion, the distortion is to say that the British are jealous, the British are bitter, because one journalist has raised a question that has been raised before. It's a legitimate question about foreign aid. Whatever you think of that, it's a legitimate question. And this idea, because the counter argument is, oh, well, the British took 45 trillion. Well, I'm not sure how that figure is reached. It's an estimate, but regardless, the question there is about the past. So, should Britain claim, well, Norwegian Vikings, Danish Vikings exploited the jewels of monasteries in the northeast of England 1,000 years ago? The time gap is different, but what's the implications are about past grievances. So it's this pride coupled with grievances, and using that as a battering ram every time. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this up. People will interpret this however they want. All I can say is I'm not anti-India. I want the UK and India to have good relations. Of course I do. That's better than bad relations. But I just think if the response of Indian nationalists is always, always, always colonial guilt, or denying problems that are going on in India, then how can it be a mutually respectful relationship? Because if you're shaming people, people are going to be defensive. And the thing is, most Britons are not negative about this moon landing story. If I was an Indian, I'd be proud of it. It's a big scientific achievement. But Britain has achievements too. I mean, we are far, far ahead of India when it comes to the Olympics, right? So, India, you need to catch up in that regard. But anyway, the point I'm making here is, shouldn't Britons be proud of that? We are. But, it's just, I think there's double standards, and I think that it's a little bit manipulative to always, always use the past to try and shame people. It's just because, like I say, I could bring up things that India has done as a republic that are less than savory, but I don't do that every time because I mean, I'm not going to say, well, India's had this successful lunar probe. Oh, by the way, look what happened with Operation Blue Star. But it becomes a cycle. When you shame one side, then they're going to get defensive. Anyway, I'll leave it there. But my final thoughts are: I'm not anti-India. I want good Anglo-Indian relations. I don't think it can be based constantly on shaming the British. Um, I think that foreign aid is a complex subject. I think Patrick Christys has a right to raise a question as a journalist, and that's my position. And I hope to visit India one day. It's a great country, and I'd like to see it one day. Thanks for watching.